Everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. With me today is Devon Campbell from Product. Devon, how you doing?
I'm great.
Good to see you. Several months ago, you came to me and asked, "Hey, what if we did a podcast on verification and validation?" And I was in Boston a few months ago as well, and so we managed to do
Mhm.
that. We got together and tried to record that in person on a park bench, and neither one of us are IT guys, it turns out.
We're
So
not
take
AV
two.
guys. We're not AV guys.
That's right, AV.
Our our video worked fine. It was the audio that we both struggled to catch good audio. So
Right. So let's do take two. And so just to kind of set the stage, those of you listening, my goal for this, and if you have a different goal, Devin, we'll pivot. We'll try to catch all the goals. But one of my thoughts was it would be great to be able to speak to an early stage company that's building a medical device that they know verification validations on the horizon. Maybe they don't have a solid understanding of what that really entails and what the differences are. So I thought it'd be good to talk about those different things. So what are your thoughts?
yeah, I think that's a valuable discussion to have. I think there's a lot of misconceptions and there's a lot of misunderstanding, especially for early stage folks, or for first time entrepreneurs in the medical device space, or for newbies to the medical device space, right? And maybe you're working at a larger company and you're listening to better understand what does verification mean, what does validation mean. Um, Really easy like tell is whenever someone says, "Oh yeah, I'm working on V&V," and they kind of lump it all together like it's one thing when it's really two very separate things,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of like a that's a good tell right there if you're playing poker with someone. They're like, "Oh yeah, I know V&V." Like I know you're not holding a full hand right there. Um, so yeah, I think let's get into it.
So and I know I'm talking to an engineer, so I'm going to speak
Yeah.
engineer speak for just a moment, just dabble barely. So I feel like we should go back to step one, but really we don't go to step one when we talk about verification validation. We go to step zero. The zeroth part is far upstream, and that's user needs and design inputs. Would you agree? And how do you want to tackle this?
Yeah. So verification, validation, those are exercises, and we'll get into what those mean. But those are exercises that a team will get into toward the end of their product development processes. Not at the end, but toward the end. But in order to verify that your design output, and we're probably going to have to stop and define what a bunch of these things
Yeah,
mean.
why don't we do that?
But
Yeah.
let's get a few on the table and then we'll define them, right? So to verify your design output requires you to have very strong requirements that you will verify against. And then to validate your design output, you have to have strong user needs to validate against. Okay. So design output, what does that mean? A lot of times you might think, well, I got to verify my device. Like imagine whatever the medical device might be. You can it's a band-aid, so it's a class one medical device, or it's a an in vitro diagnostic, it's a class two, right? The device is not what you verify. It is the design output, which is the totality of the device itself, but also how you make the device and how the device is tested and how is it cleared and everything, and how do you package it and all of that stuff. That's all part of your design output. So people tend to think of a little bit more narrow minded. So I have to do V&V on my device, or I have to do V&V on the software.
Right.
And it's actually broader than that. Like the software or the device itself is not your only piece of design output. There are larger pieces of design output. An easy way to think of it for those that may not know that are listening, think of design output as like everything you would hand to someone so they would know exactly how to make your thing, how to test your thing, how to fabricate it, how to buy the parts, how to inspect all the parts, the totality of all of that coming together for you making a lot of 1,000 widgets. That whole thing is kind of your design output, right? Think of it as like everything that's in your device master record. Um, think of it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any questions on that? Do you think we're clear?
I think that makes sense. So design verification, you're verifying that the design outputs have met the design inputs. Let's go on
Yeah.
to validation.
So let's say it in plain English. Let's not use FDA speak or ISO speak. Verification is you asking yourself and then proving to yourself with evidence, did we build the product right? Or did we build the product correctly? Okay, so did you design the right thing? Now, validation asks a slightly different question. Validation asks, did you design the right product? And there's two words juxtaposed at the end, but it makes a very, very big difference. So you can, with your design input, your product specifications, your product requirements, right? It needs to do this. It needs to, the device shall do this. The system shall do that. The system shall do this. You're verifying through testing that it does do those things. User needs, and there's a lot of podcasts I've been on where we talk about an expansion of the mental model of the idea of a user need. I don't want to get into that in this conversation because it's an entire podcast worth of conversation, but it's searchable. People can go find it. User needs, like, that's what they want the system to do. So you can actually, you interpret what that means in design specifications. Say, this is what I think I'm going to build to meet those user needs. You can test your system and say, did I make this thing the way I intended to? Yes. Does it do what I intended it to? Yes. Now I put it in the hands of users and say, does it do what the user wants it to do? And you can very easily pass verification, but fail validation because you had weak user needs. You didn't really necessarily understand the market or understand the needs of the users. And both of those, I mean, that kind of point illustrates the idea that you can't do verification or validation without very, very strong and well-informed requirements. So I think we should probably talk a little bit about requirements and requirement management and stuff like that right now.
Yeah. So you talk about the word strong user needs. And I know we don't need to get into a whole philosophical argument about user needs necessarily, but could you give some examples of strong versus weak user needs, or ones that continually fail, or a validation might fail due to the weakness of the user need?
Sure, I'll give you one of my favorite for user needs. When I write user needs and requirements management, and then requirements management, product development, and verification validation, like my fun place. It's like where I really love to do work. And especially in requirements management. Getting those well articulated is very much an art, and it takes a bit of time to like get it down well. So for user needs, I like to write user needs in the voice of the user. And so you'll often, like, a weak user need might be the user expects the system to be easy to use.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so what does that mean? So now I have to think about how would I validate that? But my problem here is, and I have no problem with the idea of easy to use in a validation, in a user need statement. Because in the voice of a user might very well say, I need it to be easy to use. So I like to honor the voice of the user. The trick here, though, is who's the user in that sentence? Is it the doctor who consumes the data from the IVD? Let's say it's an IVD. Is it the doctor that consumes the data that comes out of the in vitro diagnostic product? Is it the technician that performs the test? Is the user the technician who has to draw the blood or get the tissue sample and then put it into the cartridge or the thing that you need to be able to stick it in the system? Who's the user? Is the user the patient? So that's one of my, like, the common, like, problems I see. Like, a lot of times we just say the user needs blank, but we don't define who that user is. So I'd rather, for user needs, call out that user, right? So I'd say the technician running the test expects the system to be easy, right? Or maybe if it's an at-home type device, right? You could say the parents of a child needing to use this device. Think of like a COVID test, right? The parents of a child administering a COVID test expect the test to be blank, right? Or they need the test to be blank because they're helping and it's the kid. That kid has user needs that needs to be honored. The parents have user needs that need to be honored. You can't just say the user. It's a cop-out. You need to call them out, and there might be 4 or 5 different users who all have similar user needs that overlap, but then you have like nice, robust user needs. And when it comes time to validation, I have a better chance of being able to validate that because let's say it's the parent example. I could give the test and let, 30, 40, 300 parents try it and then administer a survey afterwards and ask them to do like a rank scaling between 1 and 10 or 1 and 7. How strongly do you agree with the following statement? The system was easy to use. And you could say, strongly agree on one side, strongly disagree on the other. Right in the middle, you could just say agree.
Yeah.
And then
Interesting.
you can measure ease of use by getting a big enough population and then asking people the question and saying, you know what, I'm going to set the target for myself is, what did I say, 1 to 7? As long as I get a 4 or better on average, I'm going to say my system is easy to use. And you can validate, but I had a discrete population that I knew who to go test. So the requirement was written well, that I knew how to validate it later.
So mild tangent there. Do you ever go into negative numbers like -5 to +5, or does that?
Doesn't matter. If you want to, fine. Then say on average, I want the score to be 0 or better.
Yeah. Um, One of the other questions I was curious about for organization purposes on the user side, when you say user may be a cop out, and I think that's a really good point. I've often thought that myself. How do you have any recommendations on breaking that out, or just because here's the problem that I see potentially being, you might say the technician needs this, the technician needs that. I feel like you need to come up with a full list of user needs from that perspective and then move on to the next one for a full list versus cherry picking different ones, or what are your thoughts?
Um, if I was advising someone who's never done it before and like, helping them think through that scope, the user universe that they might consider in their user need requirements, I would first think of who does the device touch? And you can think of it that way. That's a very easy way. Like, who are the people that touch this device? Well, it touches the patient, most likely. It touches the person who puts it in the patient or puts it on the patient or pulls the patient out and puts it on the device in an IVD sense. So think of like who does it touch and then who consumes the information that it generates. And the last one that I'd like to suggest is like follow the money. Who pays for it? Because they have needs and expectations of a medical device. So you might think that sounds weird, but I can give an example. Think of a lab manager, right, who makes the decision to buy a piece of equipment to be in their lab that can perform some kind of assay or do something, right? Or it's a piece of equipment that, a hospital would use. The doctor isn't the one who actually pays for it. The hospital is paying for it, right? Who's in charge of the hospital? Who has to buy that one thing? They might have specific user needs. And so I like to follow who does it touch, who consumes the information that it generates, because most of them generate information of some kind, and then who pays for it. Like follow that money through. You don't need to follow all the way through to, a ridiculous degree, but at least think through 1 or 2 degrees of separation financially from the user, like from the patient. Well, of course, the patient pays for it. They have insurance. Go beyond that. Like move a little bit further.
Yeah. No,
That gives you a nice scope, a nice boundary.
I like that. The way I've looked at it in the past is kind of thinking about your supply chain. I know it's not this perfect analogy, but when you think of supply chain, who provided this, who assembled it, and so on, and it's just the same thing. What's the life cycle of your medical device? You get your full
Yeah,
list of users or potential
yeah,
interactors. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
If you want to go for bonus credit there,
Let's do it.
you think about who deals with your device when it's done. You think about the end of the life cycle. We don't have as much attention that we give to that here in the US, but if you're in Europe, a lot more attention is given to it. So if you're thinking of bringing a medical device to Europe, you probably ought to think about in your user need statements your end of life situations for the device. How does it get thrown away? Does it get recycled? Does it have electronics in it? So now, we comes into play, RoHS comes into play, like all these different things come in, but they come end of life and they're geography based.
Yeah, and even in the US, if it needs to go into a sharps container, for example. So yeah, there's lots of good things
Yeah,
to need to be
yeah,
thinking about. Okay, so that's user needs, and I know we could go
yep,
further. User need, like you said, it's probably multiple
yeah.
days
Let's
conversation,
not.
but
Let's
design
not. Yeah.
inputs. So once you've developed those, you've got your list of your supply chain, your total life cycle, all of the user needs required. What about design inputs coming from those user needs?
So in my experience, each user need will give birth to several design input. We can keep calling them design inputs. That's a very kind of FDA centric way of calling it. Um, I mean, they're product requirements, right? And maybe that's just an easier way for us to think about it than design input. Um, so each one will need several requirements in order to usually, sometimes it's one to one, but usually it's a one to many relationship where you'll have several requirements that you would say, okay, think of it as a what versus how situation. The user need is the what is wanted. Now it's our responsibility as developers of medical devices to say, how are we going to deliver that what? Okay. So I make some assumptions and I say, well, they want it to be, there might be a need for there to be a kill switch on the front. I mean, for there, maybe there's some, whatever. There's a user need that needs to be a kill switch on something, so you can cut power to it. Well, I might make design decisions to say, okay, the system has to have a kill switch. It needs to be, I'm going to design one that's red. I'm going to design one that's easily visible. So I would say the power switch must be must be high contrast so that people with color blindness can still see it. It needs to be unobstructed. It needs to be. I come up with all these requirements that I feel I would need to be able to deliver the ability to cut power, which is the user need. I want to be able to cut power in the case of an emergency. How am I going to do that? I come up with lots of ways that I'm going to do that. So you can see like one user need becomes several design inputs.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And so from each one of those, well, maybe a different question is, can you have a design input without a user need or requirement, I suppose?
Oh, that's like master's level right there. Yes, you can. Um, Other sources of product requirements, other sources of design input beyond user needs. Your risk matrix will absolutely be a source of requirements. So you go at some point, you're going to build early, hopefully, you're building a preliminary hazard analysis. And as your product grows, you're starting to build a more sophisticated hazard analysis. Maybe you start entertaining FMEAs, which by themselves are not 14971 compliant. I know people are listening, can't see you nodding, but you're agreeing with me
Yeah,
with vigor. Um, you might do a fault tree analysis, whatever. I mean, you're going to do all these different things that eventually bubble into your hazard analysis or your risk matrix that will generate things that need to be mitigated by design. Those that becomes a requirement. So it's a really nice way to like link. I'm glad you brought it up because it helps illustrate the intimate relationship between risk management and requirements management. Because risk management, developing a device to your requirements will generate risks of that device, and then mitigations of those device risks that you come up with in your risk table turn into new requirements. There are other sources of requirements too, for design input. Once you have a product marketed and you start getting complaints, you start getting feedback, those are also really good sources of design requirements. So you can have new design inputs that say, you know what, we're getting a lot of feedback on blah, blah, blah. I think we need to make this one change. Do we have a requirement around this? Because we shouldn't just make a change willy-nilly. We should come up with a requirement and then design a solution to meet that requirement so that we can then verify that change that we're making on the launched product. So yeah, it does not have to be exclusive from just user needs. You also trace your design inputs back to complaints, internal CAPA system type issues that you might see that you want to track and trend and get in front of. But especially if there's any one great source, it's going to be your risk matrix.
yeah. I like that you brought that up. Um, just so those
You
who
brought
are
that up, not
listening,
me.
Well, risk management specifically, when I think about ISO
Yeah, okay.
14971, I summarize it into the three main mitigations that they want. Safety inherent by design, which, if you're gonna, that's changing your design. It's gonna change and change those requirements. Those protective measures or information for use or labeling. So those are all,
Which is always the worst way to answer to solve the
yeah,
problem, but
yeah.
sometimes it's your only way.
You have
Yeah,
to have a last resort, I suppose.
yeah, yeah.
So we've come up with a list of design inputs then as a medical device manufacturer. Now we're going to, this is funny. Okay, so I'm just going to throw this out there. Design inputs to
Huh?
outputs. To me, it's one of the funniest jumps as a mechanical engineer because that is what you do for a living is that input
Yeah.
to output
You do the
requirements.
translation. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
we've summarized it into 40 hours a week for 300 54 weeks, I think, is how long engineers work a year. But anyway,
yeah.
turn that into that whole product development process into a single jump from inputs to outputs. But do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, you just belittled my entire experience. Been designing medical devices since the 90s, and that's all I'm really doing. I'm just turning inputs into outputs. That's all I do.
And I
Um,
say that jokingly because I was a mechanical engineer as well, and it's always
yeah,
amusing to me. So
yeah, yeah. It's okay. I own it. Um, so I think there's an important piece to dwell here on, though, before we move off of the design inputs or product
okay,
requirements piece. There is, we owe it to ourselves, which is the reason why we should be doing it, because it generates world-class products and devices that meet the safety and efficacy expectations of our patients. With those things in mind, if you do what I'm about to talk about, you are also meeting the regulations and the expectations of both 820 and 1345, and soon to be QMSR for 820. You can't just come up with the requirements in a vacuum and just let them sit there. So it is expected that we have processes in place that we can look at the totality of the requirements that we've come up with. Even if you and I start a medical device company, I can't and I shouldn't just come up with all the requirements and you say, yep, like we should have some evidence that we've stopped and we've considered the totality of them together. And we've kind of pushed back and forth and made sure, do we have any redundant requirements in our feature set? Because usually it's requirement creation by like a larger group. It's not really by committee. Sometimes it's by committee, but generally everyone breaks off and we start coming up with the requirements. And you're going to come up with one that's very similar to one of mine, and they're going to overlap by 90%. But there'll be a subtle difference, and we should tease those things out. But we do have a regulatory and quality system expectation that we have processes in place to review our requirements and make sure that we don't have redundancies in them, we don't have discontinuities in our requirements, and specifically I mean product input, design input, like product requirements, and that we don't have disagreement. And then you can kind of go a little bit further, and you make sure that, which is good requirement writing etiquette, are the requirements that we've written testable? So when we're writing a design input requirement, product requirement, we always need to be having that in the back of our mind. So you write the requirement in such a way that you know how it can be tested, even though you've never even designed the device yet. Because the requirement creation should happen right at the very start. So we haven't even gotten to verification and validation yet. But at the very start of the life cycle of the development of that device, you should be thinking about verification and validation, especially on the verification side. How would I test this requirement that I'm writing? Because what we don't want to do is write requirements that when we get to verification time are impossible for us to verify. And then we just kind of muck our way through it, and the water gets murky, and we hope that no one catches it. And then at some point later, someone, let's say a 1345 certification auditor might come in and say, well, wait a second, how did you verify this? Like, what test you did does not verify your requirement. Why? Because the requirement you wrote was either ambiguous, it was open to interpretation, it wasn't clear, it wasn't measurable. There's a lot of like things that lead to it not being testable.
yeah, yeah,
So you really have to spend a lot of time when you're thinking about the requirements to make sure, in my mind, how would I test that? And when I write requirements, I like to, like in the notes of the requirement, I write down just a few bullets. How would I test this? Would I test this via test? Would I do testing? Would I do inspection? Would I do analysis? Like, there's a couple different ways that you can test a requirement in verification. I put down, I would do inspection. And what would I inspect? I would inspect these three things and I would look for it across these areas. And so at least I have a basic skeleton for how I might verify this requirement before I've ever even designed it. And I'll tell you, as a design engineer and as a leader, having led lots of teams of design engineers, if we have the unique ability or opportunity to design to a requirement and we know how it's going to be tested later, it actually gives us additional information as design engineers to design the thing to make sure that we pass the test. So it's a little bit of starting with the end in mind, and you think, oh, well, I know they're going to test blah, 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 and we're going to do this reliability study. So I'm going to over engineer some of the reliability aspects of my system so that I make sure that I not just meet, but exceed my test protocols.
Right. Yeah. I'm just trying to think of an example as you were talking. It's like, okay, if of an engineer trying to meet the test, which you might think, well, teaching to the test, that's cheating. But you know, if you're not trying, if you're not cheating, I feel like. So if you have maybe a certain aspect of your device that has to be measured, that has to be a very tight tolerance, but you build it in a subassembly that goes into another assembly, and you're going to try to test that at the end. Well, you need to be able to take it apart at least, maybe something that doesn't get welded or I can't think of the different process that I'm sonic welding in a plastic injection molded piece before it ever gets to the inspection. Then that's something to think about. You know, maybe you can measure it from a different way than a caliper. But if they know what the test is going to be, I think that's really valuable. It's really good.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. What else about design inputs to outputs?
I think we dove into the early side of it. I think maybe we could start to move in, unless you think there's something that we're missing. It might be good to kind of move into the meat of the spirit of the podcast, which is
Yeah,
verification,
you've already mentioned
validation.
you've already mentioned that as you're thinking about these design outputs requirements, you're going
Yeah,
to consider how you're going to verify these.
yeah.
Um, what is the thought? I mean, there's different ways to verify things, but maybe we could go in one more time into some examples of what verification looks like.
Okay, so verification. Let's set some ground rules. Okay, and we'll bust a few myths too. Verification is, again, did we build the product right? Right? Did we build what we intended to build? Not does it meet the needs of the users? So verification inherently opens up the opportunity for us to potentially do bench testing for some of our verification. Right. So let's say you have, think of a medical device, you come up with it that has like multiple subsystems to it. Go
Insulin
ahead,
pump.
just pick up an insulin pump. Okay. So we have an electronic circuit in the insulin pump, right? So we might be able to do some of the verification of the electronics, the circuitry of our system without having to have the entire pump. We don't have to have the entire thing final assembled and everything. We can prove that it's resilient to, you know, dirty power or something like that, right?
Yeah. Or
So
flow
we
rate.
can do that.
Yep.
Right. So we can do all these different tests on the bench. The units under test, we need to have like part numbers for them. They need to be under design control. We need to know what rev everything was when we tested it. But you don't necessarily always have to do verification on the fully assembled, fully built thing. Nor does it have to necessarily be built like in the factory.
Yeah.
But you do need to know what you did your testing on. So definitely design controls are in place for sure. Should have been in place a long time ago, way before you got to verification and validation, in my opinion. I turn them on as early as I possibly can, but make the change process easy early. And then you can add more hoops that you have to jump through toward the end. But the earlier you document and the more frequently you revise, the richer your design history becomes and the better you look in an audit later, that you have this really gorgeous, rich design history behind you.
Yeah. So a protocol at revision whatever was it tested the revision, a specific revision of that board, for example, and
Right,
what tests
right, right,
tested what revision.
right,
Yeah.
right, right.
I want to go
And
back up for go ahead.
yeah, no, go back up. I want to hear it.
Well, I wanted to back up just a minute because we're talking about testing or verifying different components of the device, which I think is really valuable. But I think we kind of skipped
Right.
over, or I meant to ask this with design review. So with design review, we typically look at that as stage reviews, and I separate those in my mind from a project management standpoint, technical review
Mm-hmm.
versus stage review. But a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people look at, okay, we've got all our user needs, let's do a design review. We've got all our design inputs, let's do a design review. How do you look at that? And do you see design reviews being broken up in a similar way, verifying a component of the device versus the entire subset or the entire set of the design inputs? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we can get into philosophical differences here, and I'm sure plenty of listeners might have completely different opinions on how to do this than I might espouse right now. But we did mention earlier, like we do have to generate objective evidence that we have processes in place within our quality system to review our requirements and make sure that they are good requirements. They can't be, that's really designed to make sure that you don't have inconsistencies, you don't have, and you don't have a person coming up with everything, right? So of course we have to have a evidence of that review having happened. I don't care if it's in a design review, a phase gate review, if you use a phase gate process, if you're using a completely agile lean process, it's going to be different. It's not the stereotypical waterfall process that everyone feels like you have to take because that's the one picture that was shown in the guidance for 820 that the FDA showed. I don't care. I mean, what matters is that you've documented it. So for the requirements, so absolutely yes, your requirements need to be under design controls. They should have their own revision. I like to think that the best in class way to control requirements is on the individual basis, not as a document with all the requirements in it.
Okay.
And I'll give an example of that just so like it's clear for anyone else who's maybe new to the field. When I started in medical devices, we started with a PRD, a product requirement document, which is what we're talking about for design inputs. And we had a CMRD, like a customer and market requirement document. And the sales team wrote that. They said, Devon, this is the product that we want you to go make. And then my team on the development side said, okay, great. We're going to write the PRD. Here's how we're going to make your product for you. And it was linked. So we knew they wanted this, what they wanted. Here's how I'm going to give it to them, right? We had to review those documents, but we reviewed them as a whole. The entire document got revved, maybe 300, 400 product requirements. The entire document gets revved when you make a change to it. As opposed to like more modern, in my opinion, more modern requirements management is that you do your design reviews either on groups of requirements, but you can do them on an individual.
Yeah.
You don't need them all in one giant document, physical document that you then bump rev on every single time. It can be perfectly fine for a requirement to be at rev 0 or rev 1 and another requirement to be at rev 7, right? It just shows we've really thought through it. We've made it more precise. Once we start verification validation, be careful though. Like we don't want to move the goalposts and change our requirements.
Well,
You can, but you should do it very limitedly.
and part of the reason I bring up that design review different approach is not purely to just talk philosophical or because someone might argue, well, it's just a semantic difference. If you only change one design one requirement and it's in a document of 300, you've only changed one versus you're only reviewing one by itself. That seems it's just a theoretical exercise. However, it has literal real downstream effects in real life because if I'm going to rev up a document that's 300 and I'm going to circulate that with some different people, they are going to look at everything. There's a potential some of those that are locked down that we're not touching might say, well, you know what if we tweak these, and it draws things out. So I actually do think it makes a big difference.
Or they tweak it, let's say inadvertently, because their cursor happened to be in that
Well,
cell. And
exactly.
and they accidentally hit the backspace button, and now a pressure of 19 pascals turns into 9.
Right.
And that becomes the new requirement. And
Right.
no one knew because there were 300 and no one saw that Devon made that one change. Again, like you actually protect yourself from yourself when you're doing it
Yeah.
on a
I'm
one-on-one
just gonna
basis.
so a shameless plug for Greenlight Guru, because when I used to do this in Excel, that was my exact problem. But now in Greenlight Guru, you can lock down and have those frozen requirements at different places. So I'll just throw that out there for those who are wondering how to do this the way we're talking about.
I swear we didn't set that up, but yes, Greenlight
uh,
Guru's design controls module does let you do that.
so we go through, okay, so we can move the topic from design review. So we figured that out where we can review those different things. So let's go back to verification. You were talking about how you can verify different components, and that's interesting because I've worked at companies and worked with companies who look at DV as an event, design verification. We have accomplished that, we're moving on, and life's good.
Yeah.
How do you see
Yeah.
that?
I like this. I like to use it as an event as well.
Yeah.
It still doesn't mean that it has to be on the entire system at all times. It really depends on how you wrote the requirement. So let's bring that back to requirements writing. If we wrote a requirement to your insulin pump, if we wrote a requirement that was inclusive of the entire pump in the sentence, then
Yeah.
to honor that requirement, I need to write a verification protocol where I'm verifying against the entire pump. But if I wrote
An assembled device.
a requirement, if I wrote, yeah, against the entire device, if I wrote the requirement that said the electrical circuit must be resilient to dirty power, right? Not the entire thing.
Or even
Right?
protected from ingress protection. Yeah. You could just make
sure,
you
right.
could do
That one.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's lots of ways that we can do that. So, but you have to think about like, oh, crud. I wrote the requirement in such a way that it forces me now to do the entire system. And maybe, an insulin pump is one cost, but imagine it's like a large diagnostic device, right? Oh, like I need 4 devices to do that. And at some point, like in that product development process, the number of devices you have available to you to be able to do verification is usually limited, right? If it's a larger system, it's not like you have hundreds of them to work on, to work with. So you usually find yourself like juggling and working maybe nights and weekends to like get all the tests done within the amount of time that you're given. And resources with devices often becomes a bottleneck. So it's clever early to say, I don't need the whole device. I just need the circuit. I'm going to write the requirement to be specific to the circuit. Okay. So now we're doing design verification, right? My best suggestion here is that people doing this for the first time strongly consider a pre-verification before you get into official DV, right? With the term you just used, but design verification, right?
Yeah.
Before you get into that verification exercise, you want to go through it pretty clean. You will have deviations. You will have things that fail. That is normal. If you have an executive team or a leadership team on the development side think it's going to go through perfectly and everything works great, they're all fooling themselves.
Right.
Real life product development, we want there to be like little things that show up. Our goal is to minimize that and not have too many things show up that's bad during design verification. So to guard against that, you perform like a pre-verification. And so what that does is it gives you a chance to fully exercise your protocols that you've written, because every verification protocol needs to be written down and itself design controlled. So it all has revisions. It could test 1 requirement. It could test 30 requirements. You can have, and we're talking about test management a little bit now. You can have one test that touches several requirements. You could have another test that touches several of the same requirements. And it's okay for multiple tests to test multiple requirements. So if you ultimately look at it, you could say, how was this one requirement tested? You could say it was tested actually across 4 different protocols we did. You might think that's redundant, but it's actually smart verification planning, because later on in life, you're going to make a change to that one piece, that one little aspect of your system that you're verifying. And if you had 4 protocols that you ran before, it gives you the opportunity to at least consider which is the one that's like the least burdensome, the easiest one, the most important one that I can run right now. And I've already launched my product. Like, which one of these should I run to make sure that it's okay instead of it just being one-to-one? So I'm just saying it's okay for you to allow yourself to have permission to have overlap. There's some
Yeah.
benefit you can take from it later.
Okay.
But running this pre-verification allows you to fail in 2 ways. Either you learn your system is not going to pass the protocol, and then you think, oh, hold on, guys, we got to do some serious fixing. You'd rather learn that because maybe you didn't do enough unit testing, maybe you didn't do enough reliability testing or system integration testing ahead of time. Shame on you, but it gives you the chance to figure it out and fix it before you go into real verification. The other thing it lets you do, and let's presume none of that happened. Good design happened, and it was well informed with really good testing during the development process. All of the things between design input and design output. If your protocol was written very poorly, you may fail your protocol just because you wrote it poorly, right? So the protocol should be written so that someone who doesn't know your system necessarily, or maybe whatever minimum education you want them to have, they can open up the protocol and it tells them exactly what to do, step by step by step by step. Right? But if there is maybe you're trying to simulate a situation where a system loses power and you're trying to demonstrate that we write whatever was happening with the system at that time to some file so that when it turns on power, it can regain. And if you're in your protocol, you never put a step in there that says, okay, get it to this step and then unplug it from the wall. If you never wrote a step that says kill power, the protocol the test could fail because you never killed the power. Silly little stupid things that when the testing team is writing, or it could be the same people as the design team, which often it is, but sometimes in a larger company, they're separate. But when it's being written, you can very easily overlook little things like that. And you don't want to just leap into design verification, and then have dozens and dozens and dozens of deviations for stupid little things like that. It's just better to do a nice, clean kind of, we're going to go through and just do a really quick pre-verification. You can choose how you want to record that or not, or document it or not, but it's good to have a pre-verification step in there.
If your design verification is multiple tests, curious what your thoughts are about this. Let's say we have 40 tests that we're going to run for design verification. Do they have to be labeled as design verification, or can they be tests that would, work for? I mean, they're truly verifying the device. It's a test, and maybe not labeled as such. How does that work? What's the political?
It's fine. You don't have to call it. In my opinion, you don't have to call it a design verification protocol.
Yeah.
In the end, you'll generate a trace matrix that says, what test did you do in the company that proves that one requirement was met? And you'll say, well, I ran 3 tests that prove that one requirement was met. And these are the 3 reports, and these are the 3 protocols that I executed. It doesn't matter if they have the word design verification in them. That actually might be a bad idea because it might discourage people from using it later, even though it's a damn well written test, right?
Yeah.
You might want to reuse that test later. So yeah, I'm saying
100% agree. Yeah.
No, you don't need to use the name.
I think it's a psychological thing too. Sometimes we look at, I don't know, we psych ourselves out sometimes. But okay, one other question. Do you recommend then that the engineers who developed the device run the design verification testing, or only day shift? Or what are your thoughts on having your best design engineers doing the testing and or assembling of the devices to make sure that we have the best devices possible to test? And I'm leading the witness a little bit, pardon your honor.
I don't have too much problem with them assembling the device, right? Because they know it best. and you're not necessarily in design verification, you're not necessarily testing
The
the
manufacturing.
impact of the manufacturing of everything.
Right.
So as long as it's well documented, you know exactly what went into your UUT, your unit under test. You know exactly what went into each one. You know what configuration everything was. You hopefully you had some level of work instruction to put them together. But it doesn't need to be as buttoned up as it would be, you know, like in a full scale manufacturing situation. So I'm okay with that. Personally, I'm okay with that
Yeah.
as long as it's well documented. On the execution side, though, I mean, sometimes for a really small company, you have no choice. You have to, right?
Yeah.
It's 5 people in the company, like whatever, 12 people, you gotta. So you have to. But if you have the opportunity to, using someone who doesn't know the device as intimately and doesn't necessarily know like the protocol so intimately gives you the ability to find those little flaws in the system that you as a super experienced user, not assembler, but I mean user, will overlook and know just to do. Right.
Yeah.
And you'll tend to like also not document that. So it might be something like maybe 2 things slide past each other, and you know because you designed the part, and you've been fiddling with it for 18 months that as you enter, you know, take object A and stick it into object B, that you know that if you wiggle it a little bit, it does a better job going in.
Yeah.
And you just know that, and that's just what you've done because you've stuck object A into B 300 times in like the last week, and you just know that. But you won't necessarily you will not it will not be in the forefront of your mind, and you won't necessarily write that down. So it's good to have somebody who doesn't know it as well as you do running it for you.
Just kind of pressure testing your protocols. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, your system and
Sure.
your design. I mean, nothing is as humbling as giving something that you've invented and built and got it working beautifully and putting it in the hands of somebody else. And that's where you really learn
Yeah.
um, an incredible amount. You will never learn as much as you will when you start putting it in the hands of people outside the engineering team.
Yeah, I feel bad for the whoever invented the flat blade screwdriver, like, "Oh, this is great for hammering lids back onto paint cans." What other actionable advice do you have for medical device companies who are going through this, or tips and common challenges? Those are sometimes go hand in hand.
One thing that a lot of people overlook that I see in my practice with like the earlier stage companies, like folks that maybe just don't know, but you also see it from folks that come from bigger companies that maybe didn't have exposure to it. You need to justify how many devices you're going to use to prove with objective evidence that your system,
Mm,
that your design output meets your design input. Okay.
right.
And there are cases where it's a binary situation. A lot of times, like in software, it either shows the button or it doesn't. It doesn't matter how many devices you load the code on. It either, like, the button is supposed to turn red when something happens. Either it does or it doesn't. Doesn't matter how many devices. But if it's more an electromechanical thing, especially something that's assembled and has like tolerances and stack up analyses and things like that, I mean, stack up problems that could come into play, you need to think very carefully about how many tests are you going to do, because someone eventually is going to ask you, why did you do the testing just on one system, Etienne? And you could say, well, that's all I had. And that's a real answer. You could say that's all I had, but I understand that that statistically wasn't like a very significant test. Right? Like, don't pretend like it was. And then you got to figure out some ways to try to increase that statistical significance. But you know, do you use just one device? Do you use three? Do you use 30? Do you use 300? Like, how many, if it's on the bench, how many circuits for the insulin pump should we build up and put on the bench? Right? Is there some variability to the design that could influence the ability for it to work? So generally, we know not to do testing with just one sample. Right? We always want a couple data points to be able to prove that, yeah, there's some degree of precision and accuracy around the result. Um, Statistical validity and justification of your sample size is something that you have to do, and a lot of times people just don't. Or they'll write some overarching SOP that just says, when we do verification, We will use this approach and this approach and this approach, and it gets buried in some SOP that everyone like does
Yeah.
a read and understand training on, and then they forget about. And when it comes time to write the protocol, they've completely forgotten about that there's an SOP out there that like tries to guide that. So justifying in your protocol how many to use and why is important.
I think that's a really good point.
Um, Another area that I see like a common mistake or a challenge for people in our industry, we talk about verification, and we use these two words, verification and validation, all the time. And they mean completely different things depending on what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay? So let's give some examples. Validation of a medical device versus validation of software, like validation of Greenlight Guru. We're talking about validation. We might even be talking about software validation in both those cases, but are we talking about software validation of a tool that we use to guide our quality systems? Or are we talking about software validation in an IEC 62304 sense? Lots of different contexts in which verification and validation show up. And I do not like it when people use either of those two words out inappropriately out of those contexts. So someone says, "Oh yeah, I did some lab testing. I verified this requirement already." They didn't really, right? They just did some bench testing. You qualified. You did some experimental studies. Maybe you executed a nice DOE, but did you write a protocol? Was it under review? Did other people review the protocol before you executed it? Did
The
you have
hypothesis has
configuration
not become a
management?
theory yet.
Right. Did you have the configuration management on the thing that you did your testing on? No, you did not do verification. Don't use that word. Um, I hear verification validation all the time. But understanding that those things mean different things in different places is also very important. Because validation of like SAMD or like software in a medical device versus software as a medical device is different than validation of like the firmware on your electromechanical device, how you validate those, and like whether it's a 62304 thing or if it's more of a 13485 kind of thing. I know I'm throwing out lots of numbers, but I'm presuming everyone listening either knows what that means or have the wherewithal to go look it up. And you can't be in our industry and not know what those things mean. Knowing that those are different and you use different approaches and different methodologies is important. And you can't just lump it all into one.
Yeah.
So you might be thinking of a complex system that has software and mechanics and biology and everything else. And so think of like an in vitro diagnostic big tool, right? That's going to have, you might break up your validation or your verification into let's do device verification, let's do software verification. Because we're going to use different teams, we're going to use different people, we're going to use different methodologies, and then bring them all together in a nice report that says, yeah, we tested the whole system in this way.
Yeah. I know we're at time. You okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
I'm good.
Any last piece of advice that you have for the audience when it comes to verification, validation, or did we miss anything? Any thoughts?
Okay, I got one for you.
All right, let's hear it.
And we've been around the block. We've developed a few devices. How frequently do you see a schedule that shows product development for X number of months, maybe shows it shows pre-verification for some number of weeks. Then it shows, like in a waterfall schedule approach, it shows DV happening, let's say 2 months, ends on the 31st. And then validation starting on the 1st of the next month. Almost always, right? You
Well,
see it all
I
the
always tried to
time.
put a build in between, but yes.
That's where I'm going. Right. It's often left out. And in the spirit of continuous improvement, which is what our regulations are all about, we should be humble enough to expect something's going to come out of design verification that we might want to fix.
Yeah.
And then I have to repeat a little bit of design verification, but that's a healthy thing. That's a good thing for us to develop safe and effective products. And I see schedules all the time where you just go straight from DV right into user need validation or clinicals or whatever it is, and you haven't given yourself time to react to what you might have learned, and don't be so arrogant to think that you will not learn something, because you will. And then you force yourself into a situation. Do I make my schedule slip? Do I repeat verification on some things and start validation at the same time and do them, in parallel, which isn't great practice? Do I turn a blind eye to that? Do I just choose not to pay attention to it? It's just better to be humble and understand we're going to learn something. We should give ourselves one build of time.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a wholesale redesign. If you did your job right as the development team, you should have a pretty decent device by the time it goes into design verification. But there's going to be some subtle tweaks you're going to want to make. Give yourself time to make it.
Yeah, and I guess I want to add one question on that, because my understanding has always been, or at least my practice has always been, validation happens on a to be marketed device. So if you have a small tweak, how small does it have to be before that has to be included in the validation device?
It's a judgment call. It comes down to a benefit risk analysis, which everything we do in our space should come down to a benefit risk analysis. It also depends on like the risk of the product, whether it's like a class 3 product versus a class 2.
Yeah.
Or if it's class 1, then you can choose to opt into a bunch of this, but you're not necessarily compelled to by the regulations. So I think that really comes down to a case by case basis. It has to be a benefit risk analysis.
You're speaking to a weakness sometimes that we have as an industry, is the justification side of why we do. We just want to go above and beyond, which we should. We should always go above and beyond the standard. Standard, I think it's a misused word. Just if you think of it classically, standard is just a certain expectation that everybody should meet, and we should be able to go beyond that. However, like you said, if there's a tweak that has zero impact on risk, you've actually thoroughly analyzed that and can truly prove that, then you have justification for potentially omitting that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, you want to change the color of a knob. That's a change. It's an obvious one that that's not going to affect anything, right? It's the same. Maybe it's an anodized aluminum knob and it used to be green and you want to make it red.
Well, our HF people might have a problem with that, but
maybe you're doing it for HF reasons that you learned during verification, right?
Good point. Yeah.
So actually, that brings up an interesting learning opportunity that we often miss in verification and in validation. We're sometimes so blinded by the singular focus of executing the protocols that we have, and then that's it. But let's use the example we talked about earlier, where maybe we get a few people, not the senior or principal or engineering fellows that designed it and then built it, not using them to test it. So you use some techs or you use some folks from one of the other programs if you're a larger company. We did this at one of the really big companies I worked at before. We would just swap teams. You can just execute the protocol blindly and then get the result and say, did I pass or fail? Yes. You just missed an opportunity to ask someone for feedback.
Yeah.
You missed the opportunity to ask and say, what did you think about it? What could I have done better? What would have made... Yes, you followed the protocol to a T. Everything worked perfectly fine. When you ran the protocol, it generated the result that I wanted. Great, I win. But you missed that chance to ask that person, how could I have done that better? Do you have any other feedback? Do you have any suggestions? Do you have anything weird happen? Right? You should have a ticketing system in place or some way to record not just deviations, but observations that the user experiences while they're executing the test, even if it doesn't invalidate the test, right? Test worked fine, but I heard a weird screeching sound the whole time. Someone should be writing that down somewhere. But when you're using folks, again, going back to the idea of nothing is as humbling as putting it in the hands of people who didn't design it and having them use it. But you lose that chance if you don't ask the question.
Yeah,
it's a good opportunity.
It's a slight, maybe out of context, and maybe misusing the word validation. So you're going to have to tell me if you're going to cringe here. But I like to use the little v validation of your user needs. Anytime you talk to a physician who does it. So if I'm doing my insulin pump, I'm talking to a diabetic a physician who works with a lot of diabetics, I'll mention what I'm doing, and valid in my mind, little v validation of my user needs. It's like, yeah, do you need this? What exactly are your problems? And they um, validate or invalidate what I'm thinking on that user need. So I don't know.
I'll I'll let it slide.
All right, all right.
I did cringe a little.
I
I
can see
did
you
cringe a
cringing.
little.
I can see you cringing. What's the word you would use?
Well, if I'm developing it, right? If I'm developing those user needs and I'm getting those user stories and I'm talking to people, like I'm researching, I'm qualifying my user needs, coming up with sources.
Yeah,
I
qualifying.
don't
Maybe
like,
that's the word I'm
yeah,
looking
I'm
for.
I'm
But this
qualifying. I
is
like
even
the word
after I,
qualifying.
just yeah, okay, yeah, good. I like it. Okay, Devon, thank you so much.
Sure,
Fingers
man.
crossed this episode works. And I'm excited. Well, those of you who've been listening, we'd love to hear any feedback. If you have any thoughts, go deeper in this, go deeper in that, or of a completely different topic altogether. I know Devon has years and extensive experience. I love getting to talk to him, especially with the specific examples that he uses. But thank you so
I
much.
think we, and I think
Yeah,
we have fun. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. I hope
This is
listeners do too.
this has been fun. This is a topic that's really fun to talk about because it is a controversial topic too. There's a lot of different ways you could approach things. Some
Yeah.
better than others, case by case sometimes. But thought it's been really good advice. Devon, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Those who've been listening, we will see you all next time. Take care.